This story is sure to provoke a skeptical smile from many, as it involves the bankruptcy of a financial company, millions of dollars in fraud, fake identities of one of Interpol's most wanted criminals, and yes, murder. On July 28, 1996, the fishing vessel Malcary set out to sea from the port of Brixham in Devon on the southwest coast of the United Kingdom, with 2 fishermen on board. The first catch was disappointing, so they decided to sail another 6 miles to a spot where fishing boats rarely appear. An hour later, they began hauling in their catch, but along with the fish, they made another unpleasant discovery: a human body. The discovery of the body marked the beginning of an extraordinary investigation involving international inquiries, the involvement of Interpol, and a series of false identities assumed by the same individual. But at first, the Devon and Cornwall police believed they were dealing with a tragic, yet still accidental death. Given the high volume of boats passing through the channel, the police assumed that the man might have fallen from one of them, though there had been no reports of missing persons at the time. Surprisingly, the body was in remarkably good condition despite being in salt water. The man was dressed in a long-sleeved shirt, trousers, and brown shoes, with no identification documents on him. However, he was wearing a Rolex watch that displayed the time and date, July 22nd. The pockets of his trousers were turned inside out, as if someone had rummaged through them before the police. The examination of the body revealed several injuries, including a wound on the head. However, this didn't immediately raise suspicions, as the man had been brought to the surface during trawling, and the injuries could have been caused by the trawling equipment. The only distinctive feature on the man's body was a tattoo on the back of his right hand, which at first appeared to the police as a cluster of stars. However, the best clue to the man's identity came from his wristwatch. Detectives consulted with representatives from Rolex in London, who informed them that if the watch had ever been sent in for regular servicing, it might be possible to trace its origin. Rolex watches need regular checks by an authorized distributor or service center to maintain their accuracy and waterproof qualities. It was discovered that the watch had indeed been sent for servicing at a jewelry store in Yorkshire at the request of a man named Ronald Joseph Platt. Finally, the detectives were able to identify the man. They found his last known address. Ronald Platt had been living in a rented house in Chelmsford, Essex. When the local police contacted the landlord, he provided them with the phone number of the person Ronald Platt had listed as a personal reference when he moved in, a man named David Davis. Detective Sergeant Peter Redman of Essex Police recalls, "I called Mr. Davis, introduced myself, but refused to tell him the reason for my call because I didn't want to say that his friend might no longer be alive. But eventually, he forced me to admit it, and I had to tell him." It's hard to judge someone's reaction over the phone, but he didn't seem particularly shocked. He didn't start asking a lot of questions, as people usually do. David Davis agreed to meet with the police to answer their questions about Ronald. In reality, the police had few questions. They were confident that Ronald Platt had fallen overboard and drowned. It was an unfortunate accident. Only a few final formalities remained before the case could be closed. During the meeting, David Davis made a good impression on the detective. He seemed like a very pleasant person. The man explained that the tattoo on his friend's hand was actually a maple leaf, not a constellation. He promised to find a photo of Ron to show to the detectives, and he did. The case would have been closed at that point, but Detective Constable Ian Clenahan needed to speak with Mr. Davis again. However, Davis wasn't answering phone calls, so Clenahan asked a colleague in Essex to visit Mr. Davis's address and ask him to get in touch. Detective Sergeant Redman went to the given address. I had never been to that street before. The area looked quite rural, with only a few houses on the street. None of the houses had nameplates, so I went to the nearest house and knocked on the door. An elderly couple answered. I said I was looking for a particular address. They explained that I was mistaken and needed the house next door. Just to be sure, I asked if David Davis lived there, and they said, no, Mr. Platt does. The description of the man they knew as Ronald Platt matched exactly with the man known to the police as David Davis. We were talking about the same person. Detective Sergeant Redman reported his findings to the Devon police. Suddenly, it became clear that David Davis was far more significant to the investigation than initially thought, and it became obvious that he knew more than he had told the authorities. Redmond admits that he often wondered what would have happened if he had knocked on the other house and reached the correct address. He would have spoken to Mr. David Davis, who he expected to find there, and that would have been the end of the story. Instead, Redmond went back to talk to the neighbors about Davis and his family. Frank and Audrey told Redmond about their neighbor. Some time ago, he had arrived with a wife much younger than him and two small children, a baby and a child around 3 years old. The neighbors said that the family quickly integrated into the local community. They also mentioned that the man had a connection to Devon because he had a boat there, which he regularly took out to sea. The mention of the boat piqued the police's interest, but without knowing the boat's name or description, they didn't know how to find it. Investigators then decided to re-interview all witnesses in the hope of uncovering something they might have missed earlier. They started with the fisherman who had found Ronald. The fisherman reported that, along with Ronald Platt, the trawl had also brought up an anchor. The police took the anchor, though at that time they had no idea that it would soon become a key piece of evidence in the case. Meanwhile, the investigators were trying to learn more about David Davis's friendship with Ron Platt. Ronald's brother mentioned that Ron had been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Elaine Boys, who lived in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. The police spoke with Elaine and began to learn more about Ronald and the life he had led. Ronald and Elaine had lived together for 10 years until 1993. He was a very quiet, calm, pleasant, and caring person. Elaine said that Ronald's most prized possession was his watch. He was generally obsessed with electronics and precision engineering. He wore the watch constantly and never took it off. She also explained their connection to David Davis. Elaine had met him 5 years earlier in Harrogate when he visited an auction house dealing in art, where she worked as an administrator. It was a very quiet day with no phone calls, and the man spent about an hour and a half inside, talking with Elaine first about the auction, paintings, and antiques. Gradually, the conversation shifted to what the man did for a living. He mentioned that he was moving to Yorkshire and was looking for a place to live near Harrogate in the Dales. Then, incredibly, at the end of the conversation, he offered Elaine a job. She thought it was amazing, but remembered that she wouldn't be able to work for him for long because she and her boyfriend, Ron Platt, were planning to move to Canada. Davis responded that it was fine. He promised to help the couple save money for their move to Canada because Elaine would earn more with him than at the auction house. Elaine introduced Davis to Ronald, and their friendship began from the first meeting. Soon after, David Davis offered them a share in his new company. The new company was called Cavendish Corporation, which sounded very solid and reliable. He made Ron and Elaine the nominal directors of the company. When asked why, he explained that he didn't want to be a director himself because of his wife, who was demanding alimony from him. Therefore, he didn't want his name to appear on any documents. Davis claimed that his wife was building a brilliant career as a doctor in New York and didn't need any money. However, she was greedy and was trying to take her ex-husband's money. That was his explanation, and Elaine and Ronald simply believed Davis. Elaine's job involved traveling around Europe and inspecting properties, but none of them were ever purchased. Instead, during her business trips, she made deposits for her boss into his foreign accounts. Looking back, she realizes that Davis had drawn her and Ronald into his little world, which was, in reality, just a facade. But at the time, the couple never doubted Davis for a moment because he made an excellent impression on everyone around him. At Christmas in 1992, Elaine and Ronald were invited to Davis's home where they met his daughter, Noel. Noel seemed to be in awe of her father. Davis did most of the talking that evening, while Noel, although not overly shy, was still quite reserved. Before saying anything, she always looked to her father for approval. Davis gave the couple a generous holiday gift. Enclosed in Elaine's Christmas gift was a card in which Davis promised to buy them 2 tickets to Canada if they agreed to leave by the end of February. February 1993. For Elaine, this was a shock, as they needed to settle all their affairs within just 2 months. How could they just up and move to Canada in such a short period? But Ronald was thrilled with the offer because it was his dream. The couple did ask David Davis why they needed to leave so soon. He explained that they had always wanted to live in Canada, that it was a great opportunity, and he essentially convinced the couple to move. Moreover, he had a ready-made idea of how they could remain directors of his company. Davis explained that they could make rubber facsimile stamps with their signatures so that while the couple was in Canada, He could use these stamps to sign documents and checks. He added that he had always been the one managing the affairs, so the couple didn't find his proposal strange or suspicious. Ronald and Elaine left for Canada in February 1993, but life in the new country didn't go well. The couple struggled financially. Elaine couldn't work there, and Ronald initially had trouble finding a job. On top of that, it was the middle of winter, so they had a very tough time. After 5 months, Elaine returned home to be the maid of honor at her sister's wedding. Davis was also invited, but when he found out that Elaine didn't want to return to Canada, he clearly didn't like it. He started talking about how much he loved Ron, how he didn't want the couple to break up, and that everyone deserves a second chance. In short, he did everything he could to convince the woman to go back, but she was determined not to return to Canada. Just a few days after the wedding, Davis packed his things and left town. Elaine felt like her friend had cut her out of his life. He just left, leaving her only his mobile phone number but no address. What the woman couldn't possibly know was that from that moment, her friend started calling himself Ronald Platt and would continue to do so for the next 3 years. Elaine barely communicated with him or her ex-boyfriend, the real Ronald Platt. During this time, she learned that Ronald had returned to the UK, but she, of course, had no idea about the fisherman's discovery in July 1996. And when she last spoke to Davis, 3 months after the police investigation began, he didn't even mention it. At the end of the phone conversation, the woman herself asked if he had heard anything about Ron, to which Davis replied that he hadn't spoken to him since June because Ron had gone to France. It was only after speaking with the police that Elaine realized Davis had lied to her. The detectives told the woman they had spoken to Davis, but he hadn't been able to help them. She asked when this conversation took place, and it turned out it was several weeks ago, which made Elaine suspicious. She immediately thought something was wrong. The Davis she had spoken to recently hadn't told her that Ronald was no longer alive. Elaine suspected that Davis might be involved in what happened to Ron, so when he called her next, she was scared. She didn't know what to say, whether to tell him that she knew about Ron, but she decided that honesty was the best policy and told him. At that moment, his voice suddenly changed. Instead of cheerfulness, there were new notes in it, and he said he would like to see Elaine at work. The woman was afraid to scare him off and didn't refuse. She agreed to meet him for coffee. During the meeting, Davis expressed how sorry he was about Ron, but the woman felt the insincerity in every word. She could see that it was just an act. And yet she played along with him. But when he left, she called the police. Investigators knew that he would take a train home, so they went to Chelmsford Station. When the suspect was brought to the police station, he was searched. The documents in one pocket identified him as David Davis. The documents in another pocket identified him as Ron Platt. Now the police had evidence that he had been using Ron's identity, but that was not enough to charge him with murder. Detective Sergeant Redman from Essex Police went to Davis's home to arrest the woman believed to be his wife. She didn't seem particularly shocked. Instead, she was more concerned about the well-being of her children. While she was packing for her daughter, a female officer who was with her noticed that the bag seemed unusually heavy. She looked inside and found several gold bars and cash, just what every 3-year-old needs. And that was just the beginning. The police found $25,000 in cash, 8,000 Swiss francs, 17 gold bars, and paintings worth $6,000. At that point, the police had no idea what they were dealing with. So they confiscated documents, paintings, and valuables. During the house search, the police also found photographs of Davis's yacht, the Lady Jane, but they still didn't know where to find the yacht itself. However, by a stroke of luck, one of the officers working on the case happened to be a sailor. He mentioned that he had seen the Lady Jane in dry dock and explained where to find it. The yacht was brought in for forensic examination. On a pillow in the cabin, they found hair and blood, as well as an empty bag from a store called Sport Nautique. Fortunately for the police, Ron Platt's fingerprints were found on the bag, and they discovered a receipt from the store during the search of Davis's house. Investigators questioned the staff at Sport Nautique, who were able to recall that 2 men had visited the store that day and purchased various items, including an anchor. But the anchor they bought did not match the Lady Jane. Moreover, the yacht already had its own anchor. However, the one they bought was identical to the one the fisherman had pulled out of the water along with Ron. When the pathologist saw it, he realized its significance to the investigation. The shape of the anchor exactly matched the wounds on Ron. Interestingly, there was also a distinct bend in Ron's belt, likely from where the weapon had been attached. Upon examining it, the forensic experts found traces of zinc, consistent with the coating on the anchor. The evidence against Davis was mounting, but it still wasn't enough to bring the case to trial. Believing that the man was an American, they sent his fingerprints to Interpol. This turned out to be a breakthrough in the investigation. Within hours, the detectives learned that the man in custody was neither Ron Platt nor David Davis. His real name was Albert Johnson Walker. He was a fugitive from Canada, suspected of embezzling millions of dollars, and he was on Interpol's most wanted list. The police began unraveling the web of lies spun by Albert Walker. Albert Johnson Walker from Hamilton, Ontario, seemed to be living the perfect life. A married man and father of 4, he had started a small accounting firm that grew into a large financial company with 6 branches and 24 employees. However, it appears that this wasn't enough for Albert because it soon became evident that he had defrauded 30 clients out of $3.2 million. Most of his clients were farmers, and he invested their funds in a company they had no access to, located in the Cayman Islands. But his business began to crumble in the mid-1980s when he decided to invest his clients' money in real estate and stocks, losing funds in both. As Christmas 1990 approached, facing 18 counts of fraud, money laundering, and theft, he took $3.2 million, his 15-year-old daughter Sheena, and fled to London. The police knew he had gone to Britain, but after that, his trail went cold. This was because Walker had assumed a new identity, that of wealthy American businessman David Wallace Davis. He likely initially used the Davis name simply to escape Canada and settle in Britain. But when that identity had run its course, he needed something new. Walker didn't have the necessary documents to get a job, so he seized the opportunity to start a business with another Canadian he had recently met, a TV repairman named Ronald Platt. Ron often spoke to Walker about his beloved homeland, Canada, and expressed his desire to return there. Ronald missed Canada so much that he even got a tattoo of a maple leaf on his right hand. Seeing an opportunity, Walker offered to pay for one-way tickets so that Platt and his girlfriend Elaine could move to Canada on the condition that they leave behind their signature stamps, so Walker could continue running the business. As we know, Platt accepted this offer. As soon as Ron was in Canada, Walker, now Davis, used Platt's documents and signature to assume the identity of his departed friend, while his daughter suddenly became his wife, who soon gave birth to 2 girls, Emily and Lily. Neighbors said that when the truth came out, they couldn't believe it. Of course, they had noticed the age difference, but otherwise, the neighbors seemed like a perfectly ordinary married couple. Walker quietly moved into a house that Platt had rented but never lived in. So, when Walker showed up there under the name Platt with a wife, no one was surprised. However, the man everyone knew as Ron Platt soon began to lose control over his carefully guarded identity. In 1995, he received news from Canada. The real Ron Platt was returning to Britain, returning for good. Walker had probably thought that by sending his friend to Canada, he could continue using his identity for the rest of his life. But that was not the case. Now, 2 Ronald Platts with the same documents and birth date were living in close proximity. Clearly, this was a threat to Walker's freedom. The fugitive from Canada had something to hide, something to lose, and a motive to kill Ron. Walker invited Ron onto his yacht, perhaps to go fishing, though, of course, with much darker intentions. Walker took the life of a friend who had trusted him completely, throwing him into the water. In June 1998, Albert Walker stood trial for the murder of Ronald Platt. He was confident. No one had witnessed the crime. No one could say how, when, or where it had occurred. However, the Rolex watch, which initially helped identify Ron, now provided crucial clues for determining the time of the crime. Even after being submerged underwater for a week, Platt's watch still held some of its secrets. The watch was waterproof and self-winding, but underwater and without movement, it stopped after approximately 48 hours. Since the watch stopped on the 22nd, the police determined that it had entered the ocean around July 20th or 21st. The GPS tracker on the yacht provided the remaining evidence. When Walker was arrested, Sheena returned to Canada with the children. 2 years later, she came to the trial. She stated that she did not know Mr. Platt had been in Devon before the crime, meaning her father had hidden from her the fact that the family friend had returned to Britain. She revealed that during that time, she, the children, and Albert Walker were also living in a cottage in Devon, not Essex. On the 8th day of the trial, Walker himself took the stand. He appeared confident, relaxed, and charming with the judge. He admitted that Ron could have been murdered, but insisted that he wasn't the one who did it. Walker explained that Ron's hair and blood could have ended up on the yacht's pillow because Ron had hit his head, but he had nothing to do with what happened afterward. The man lied convincingly and, out of habit, expected the crime would go unpunished. But for the first time in his life, Albert Walker failed to convince his listeners. It took the jury 2 hours to find him guilty. Walker was sentenced to life imprisonment. In February 2005, the convict was returned to Canada, where he would spend the remainder of his years in prison. He never showed any remorse for what he had done to Ronald Platt. Albert Walker nearly got away with this crime. The chances of the body being pulled from the water within 7 days in an area where fishermen rarely appeared were incredibly slim. If it weren't for the Rolex watch with its unique serial number on Ronald Platt's wrist, if it weren't for the anchor that the fishermen found with the body, if it weren't for the fact that an officer knocked on the wrong door and discovered that Albert Walker had assumed someone else's identity, the police might have simply closed the case, declaring that they had found Mr. Platt, and that would have been the end of the story.
On the afternoon of September 23, 2007, the Miami Coast Guard responded to a report from Jeff Branham, owner of the fishing vessel Joe Cool. The boat had not returned from a trip to Bimini, the closest island in the Bahamas, located approximately 25 kilometers east of Miami. In principle, there was nothing unusual about the boat not returning on time. Passengers might get carried away with fishing or have a bit too much to drink and need to sleep it off, often asking the captain to stay out a little longer, which naturally leads to delays. Jeff Branham reported that 6 people were on board, 4 crew members and 2 passengers. It was an experienced team, typically helping tourists catch big fish, particularly tuna. However, the passengers this time were somewhat unusual. The 2 men were not interested in fishing at all. They had simply booked a one-way trip to Bimini. The captain was somewhat puzzled and directly pointed out that a short flight would cost them much less. Why book an expensive ocean trip instead? It turned out that the men could not fly because one of their girlfriends had accidentally packed his passport in her luggage. The girlfriends were now waiting for them on Bimini in another boat. The men agreed to pay $4,000 for the 2.5-hour journey. The captain was still unsure whether to take the job, but his uncle and co-owner of the boat, Jeff Branham, convinced him to accept. It was an international trip, which meant the company could later advertise trips to the Bahamas in its service offerings. Additionally, Jake and the crew could enjoy the opportunity to fish on their way back. On Saturday, September 22, 2007, the Joe Cool set off from the dock. Another very important trip was scheduled for the following day. The boat needed to be prepared in advance, so it was crucial for the crew to return on time. However, the next morning, when Jeff Branham expected to find the boat at the dock, it was nowhere to be seen. It was highly unlikely that the captain had intentionally extended the boat's stay at sea, knowing that other clients were waiting. Jeff called the port in the Bahamas and was horrified to learn that the boat had never arrived there. Since no issues on board had been reported, he found this extremely strange and contacted the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard began their search, and to better understand what might have happened on the boat, they investigated the crew members. All 4 crew members, Jake Branham, Kelly Branham, Scott Gamble, and Samuel Sammy Carey, were residents of South Florida. Jake and Kelly Branham were in their early 20s, a married couple raising 2 children. Their eldest daughter was 3 years old, and their youngest son was just 4 months old. Jake had dreamed from a young age of becoming the captain of his own boat, running fishing charters and tourist trips. Luckily for him, his family was very wealthy, and his grandfather provided the funds to purchase his first boat and set up the business. Jake acquired a 14-meter sport fishing vessel designed to handle rough seas. The boat was equipped with everything needed for tuna fishing, making it a top-notch vessel, perfect for catching big fish and hosting tourist trips. Jake's uncle, Jeff Branham, was listed as co-owner of the boat, while Jake's cousin assisted with administrative work. Jake's older brother, Scott Gamble, and a close family friend, Samuel "Sammy" Carey, joined the crew. By 2007, after just a few months in operation, the business was thriving, attracting many clients thanks to Jake's expertise in finding the best fishing spots. Kelly, Jake's wife, didn't always accompany the crew on trips. However, this short journey seemed too appealing to pass up. So Jake and Kelly asked Jake's grandfather to babysit their kids. At the scheduled time, the couple boarded the boat along with the rest of the crew and their passengers, and they set off on their voyage. The Coast Guard disseminated all critical information about the Joe Cool to nearby vessels, including a description of the boat, the number of people on board, and the purpose of its trip. Coast Guard patrol boats scoured the route the vessel was supposed to have taken, but there was no sign of it. They had no idea what might have happened to the boat. Other sailors, friends of the missing crew, joined the search effort. While the families of the crew members were undoubtedly worried, there was hope that everything was fine since Jake, Samuel, and Scott were highly experienced seamen. However, when the Joe Cool wasn't quickly located, an official search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters took to the skies, and a plane flying the route between Miami and Bimini was also enlisted in the search. The likelihood of finding the Joe Cool was high, as the area was frequently patrolled due to its reputation as a corridor for illegal activities, such as the smuggling of migrants, particularly from Cuba, and contraband. Predictably, it wasn't long before sailors aboard a Coast Guard vessel spotted a fishing boat. However, all attempts by officers to contact the vessel went unanswered. As the ship drew closer, the crew saw the name on the boat, Joe Cool. It was indeed Jeff Branham's missing vessel, but the circumstances surrounding the boat baffled rescuers. The Joe Cool was drifting nearly 50 kilometers north of Cuba, about 225 kilometers off course. For a sport fishing vessel, there was no need to venture that far, expending unnecessary fuel to find fish. The mystery deepened when they noticed the boat's 23-meter anchor had been lowered. Even though the water was over 60 meters deep, the boat couldn't have drifted so close to Cuba on its own. This was perplexing, especially considering its original course. The route from Miami to Bimini crosses the Gulf Stream, which flows northward at a speed of 8-10 kilometers per hour. If the boat had encountered mechanical issues, the current would have quickly carried it north. For the Joe Cool to end up so far south near Cuba, someone would have had to deliberately steer it against the current. So someone had brought the boat to this location, and now no one on board was responding to the Coast Guard's calls to establish contact. In such a situation, one could imagine anything. Pirates might have been hiding in the cabin, for instance. Proceeding with great caution, the officers boarded the vessel, but the boat was, in fact, empty. However, something had clearly happened. The chaos that reigned everywhere and the presence of blood told its own story. Wallets, car keys, and other personal belongings were still there, indicating that the people on board had not intended to leave the boat in a hurry. Where were the 6 individuals who had been on the Joe Cool? Perhaps the missing lifeboat could hold the answer. The Coast Guard immediately began searching for the lifeboat. They worked against the clock as time was critical. Lifeboats are built to be sturdy, but the rescuers had no way of knowing the condition of the passengers and crew. Some or all of them could be injured, making every moment precious, especially as the weather began to deteriorate. Meanwhile, the Joe Cool was officially declared a crime scene. The Coast Guard called in the FBI, as crimes occurring on the high seas fall under their jurisdiction. 3 days had passed since Joe Cool left the port of Miami. On that day, a helicopter spent about an hour searching for the missing lifeboat when its crew spotted something orange floating in the water. It was the lifeboat. Its canopy was raised, but as the helicopter descended, the downdraft from its blades blew the canopy off. Inside the lifeboat, rescuers saw 2 people, out of the 6 who had gone missing. This was not a promising sign. The rescue team lowered a basket and brought the 2 individuals aboard the helicopter one by one. Due to the noise in the helicopter, communication with the survivors was conducted using a notebook and pen. The pilot handed them the notebook, asking what had happened and if they were okay. One of the men wrote, "West of Bimini, we were left in the boat, hijacking, 4 killed." The survivors were identified as the 2 passengers of Joe Cool, Guillermo Zaraboso and Kirby Archer. The men claimed that there was no one else left to rescue. They explained that 3 Cuban pirates had boarded the boat and killed all the crew members. After such a statement, the Coast Guard had no choice but to call off the search efforts. Meanwhile, officers continuing their work aboard the Joe Cool discovered 4 shell casings. This aligned with the fact that there were 4 victims. However, the crime scene was peculiar. It looked as though a hurricane had torn through the boat, yet nothing had been stolen. If pirates had attacked the vessel, it would make sense that they did so for money or valuables. But they hadn't stolen the boat itself, the $70,000 worth of fishing gear, the electronics, or the credit cards. Instead, they left behind odd items: an air gun, darts for it, handcuff keys, and even a shuriken. Objects considered weapons, which no one would reasonably bring on a pleasant fishing trip. This suggested the pirates had brought these items with them, but why would they leave them behind? Additionally, experienced seamen immediately noticed that whoever directed the boat against the current had done so ineptly, causing it to run out of fuel far too quickly. Pirates operating in the ocean wouldn't have made such a mistake. All these details raised serious doubts among the officers about the accuracy of the two survivors' story. The next step for investigators was to interrogate Guillermo and Kirby. If anyone had answers to their questions, it had to be these two men. Both recounted the same story. According to them, 3 Cuban pirates boarded the Joe Cool and immediately killed the captain. Next, they shot Kelly because she began to panic. The pirates then ordered the 2 other crew members, Sammy and Scott, to throw the bodies overboard. When they refused, the pirates killed them too. Guillermo claimed that the pirates then forced him to dispose of the bodies, a task he complied with in the hopes of being spared. He also said he tidied up the boat slightly under their orders. The pirates allegedly forced Kirby to take control of the vessel, abandoning their own boat as they set course southward for Cuba. The journey lasted about 8 hours until the fuel ran out. At some point, a 3rd speedboat appeared, and the pirates supposedly boarded it and sped away, leaving Guillermo and Kirby stranded in the middle of the ocean. The 2 survivors decided to move into the lifeboat, bringing their belongings, and attempted to make their way to shore. However, the neat story Guillermo and Kirby had crafted quickly unraveled when investigators began asking follow-up questions. For instance, when asked about the pirates' appearances and clothing, Guillermo described 2 young men and an older man who seemed to be the leader. According to him, the pirates wore polo shirts and jeans, but Kirby contradicted this, claiming the pirates were dressed in shirts and shorts. Their accounts also conflicted on the sequence of the killings. Guillermo stated that Jake was still alive when he was thrown overboard, while Kirby claimed that Kelly was the one still breathing at that time. The biggest inconsistency was their inability to explain why they abandoned a fully operational, well-equipped boat to climb into the lifeboat. The Joe Cool had all the necessary equipment to send a distress signal, which would have immediately brought help from the Coast Guard. By this point, investigators had a clear idea of who they should suspect, but they needed concrete evidence. Now the challenge was finding a way to keep the men in custody while building their case. First and foremost, investigators delved into the backgrounds of the 2 men, and they uncovered a lot of surprising information. Guillermo was just 18 years old. His family had moved to the United States from Cuba in 1999, and after winning the visa lottery, they settled in Florida. The young man still lived with his parents. He didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and had never had any issues with the law. Guillermo was known to be polite, social, and considerate. He worked as a security guard, but had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. In fact, Guillermo had applied to join the police force right before he and Kirby boarded the Joe Cool. Overall, everyone who knew Guillermo regarded him as a kind, generous, and thoughtful young man, and no one had a bad word to say about him. The past of 35-year-old Kirby Archer was far more eventful. His legal troubles began in 1993 when he was 22 years old. He had joined the Army after being accused of involvement in a crime involving a minor. The charge stemmed from the fact that his 15-year-old girlfriend hadn't returned home to her parents on time. In the Army, he worked for a long period as a military police investigator at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba. However, in 2003, he went AWOL, absent without leave, and was subsequently discharged from the Army. Kirby boasted that he simply chose the easiest way to leave the military, which he had grown tired of. After his discharge, he settled in Arkansas with his second wife and 2 children, but the couple soon decided to divorce. The breakup was extremely scandalous, as his wife accused him of having an affair with his own niece and fathering her child. Kirby denied any sexual relationship with his niece, but he did not deny being listed as the father on the child's birth certificate. Shortly after the divorce, Kirby became the subject of an investigation for child molestation. It's unclear whether the investigation was connected to his niece or whether it involved other matters, but the charges were serious enough that he was banned from seeing his own children unsupervised. Despite this, he eventually found love again and remarried for a 3rd time. In January 2007, about 9 months before boarding the Joe Cool, Kirby decided to test his luck. On January 26th, he went to work as usual. Kirby Archer worked as a customer service manager at a Walmart supermarket. At the end of his shift, he collected cash and checks, which was part of his duties. He then took the money, over $92,000, and the checks to a storage room. There, he took a new microwave out of its box, placed the money inside, and packed the microwave back into the box. After sealing it, he walked to the cashier, used his employee discount to purchase the microwave, and confidently walked out of the store. Kirby likely thought using his discount would make him look less suspicious, or perhaps he couldn't resist the chance to save a bit, even while stealing from his workplace. Either way, he knew the police would quickly catch up with him, so he fled. Kirby headed for sunny Miami. How did the young, law-abiding 18-year-old get involved with the 35-year-old criminal? Kirby met Guillermo in March or April of 2007. They had a mutual acquaintance, Carlos, who owned an auto repair shop. Guillermo had a strong interest in fast cars and enjoyed spending time around them. Meanwhile, Kirby had been telling Carlos that he worked for the CIA and had connections. Carlos, believing that someone with such connections could be useful to the young man who was passionate about becoming a law enforcement officer, decided to introduce them. Investigators began to piece together why 4 people were killed. The police believed that Kirby, who was facing serious charges, had never intended to go to Bimini. From the start, he had planned to turn the boat toward Cuba. Cuba has no extradition treaty with the US, and since he had once served in the military on Cuba and spoke Spanish, it would have been relatively easy for him to disappear and blend into the local society. There were many aspects that supported the police's theory. First of all, the pirates' behavior was completely illogical. It wasn't just that they didn't take valuable items. It was the fact that pirates typically don't kill people on a ship they're hijacking. 1 or 2 people might get hurt, but pirates generally try to spare everyone's life because word of mouth spreads fast. Every sailor would soon know that encounters with pirates inevitably end in death, meaning that when pirates attacked the next ship, the victims would fight back to the last man. Additionally, the police searched both Guillermo's and Kirby's homes. While they didn't find any weapons on the boat, which the criminals likely threw overboard, they were able to link the men to the weapon used in the killings. Since Guillermo worked as a security guard, he had a permit to carry a weapon issued by Florida. At his home, they found a receipt for ammunition matching the caliber of the bullets used in the fatal shooting. The men were arrested. They were informed that the police had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and the prosecution would insist on the death penalty for them. Fearing the death sentence, Kirby Archer decided to confess. He explained that he had bought a gun, and Guillermo had taken his own gun. Initially, the plan was simply to hijack the vessel and drop off the crew somewhere on the way to Cuba. The accomplices thought they would be accompanied by 2 crew members and did not expect there to be 4. However, the plans did not change. During the trip, according to Kirby, Captain Jake Brenham behaved strangely, so Kirby told Guillermo to wait for a signal. But the young man didn't listen and shot Scott and Samuel. Then Kirby shot the captain and his wife. Afterward, the accomplices disposed of the bodies and guns and headed toward Cuba, but they ran out of fuel. They had no choice but to board the lifeboat and hope that the Cuban Coast Guard would find them and take them to Cuba. Once on the lifeboat, they made up a story about a pirate attack. Since Kirby Archer decided to confess, the only thing left was to determine his punishment. With Guillermo, things were not as clear. It was unclear whether he knew about the plan to kill the crew members or if he had become the 5th victim and an unwitting accomplice to Kirby. In prison, he shared his version of events with another inmate, and he repeated the same version in court in 2008 when he took the witness stand. According to his account, Kirby had initially told Captain Jake Brenham that he had changed his mind and wanted to go to Cuba. Jake, of course, refused, and a heated argument ensued. While Guillermo briefly went to the bathroom, shots were fired. When he ran to see what was happening, he saw Kirby holding his gun. That is, Kirby had rummaged through Guillermo's bag and taken his pistol. He shot all 4 members of the crew. Then Kirby pointed the gun at Guillermo and forced him to throw the bodies overboard and clean up. After that, he started the boat and headed south, but after several hours, they ran out of fuel. Guillermo wanted to stay on the boat with his luggage until help arrived, but Kirby threw the luggage into the lifeboat and told Guillermo to get into it too. There, he came up with the story about pirates that they would tell the rescuers. Guillermo agreed to stick to it because he was afraid of Kirby. In court, he did not dispute that he had brought a gun aboard, but not for murder. He thought it would be necessary for the security work they would be doing. Guillermo believed they were going to do private security work in Bimini, and then he would accompany Kirby to Cuba for a mission with the CIA. He believed until the end that Kirby worked for the CIA and did not know that he was being sought by the police. He hoped that if he helped Kirby complete this mission, Kirby would help him get into the CIA. He passed 2 polygraph tests, and according to the polygraph examiner, he had not planned the murders. However, the prosecution did not believe in Guillermo's innocence, and they had at least one piece of evidence that the defense could not explain. The Coast Guard studied the GPS data on the Joe Cool and found that halfway from Miami to Bimini, the boat suddenly stopped. The engine was inactive for exactly 1 minute and 18 seconds before it was started again and directed south toward Cuba. That is, if we are to believe Guillermo, in just over a minute, Kirby managed to kill 4 people and intimidate his accomplice into obeying him unquestioningly and throwing the bodies overboard. This was hard to believe. Additionally, Carlos, the owner of the auto repair shop, who had introduced Guillermo and Kirby, took the witness stand. He knew about the original plan of the defendants, which initially involved hijacking a local speedboat, reaching the Bahamas, refueling, and then heading to Cuba. However, they were unable to steal a suitable boat, and a few days before the trip, they bought weapons because, as Kirby had told Carlos, they switched to Plan B. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They decided that Guillermo was guilty of causing death with a firearm, but could not find him guilty of murder. The judge later explained that the jury might have made such a contradictory decision because they believed that Guillermo did not kill the people, but was guilty because his weapon was used. It was clear that the jury was confused. The judge had to annul the trial. The prosecution tried to retry Guillermo in 2009. Guillermo continued to maintain his innocence, convinced that his actions were part of an undercover CIA operation. The evidence in the second trial against him was exactly the same as in the first trial, except that the police found something interesting on the young man's computer. It turns out that he had told his friends he was planning a trip to Cuba for a CIA mission and warned them that they might see his name in the news as missing. However, he never mentioned the trip to Bimini. Additionally, he made many search queries with the word Cuba, but only searched for information about Bimini once. According to the prosecution, this indicated that the young man had known from the very beginning that they were heading to Cuba, not the Bahamas. In the second trial, the prosecution succeeded in securing a conviction against Guillermo. He was found guilty on 16 charges. Both men were sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Still, the prosecution could never explain why Guillermo got involved in this venture. If Kirby really had a reason to flee to Cuba and was willing to do anything for it, even murder, Guillermo had no such necessity. Did he agree to participate in the murder of 4 people just for the faint promise of a job in the CIA from someone he barely knew? In any case, the men had a plan to escape to Cuba, but they did not account for the amount of fuel needed for such a journey or the difficulties of navigating the boat against the Gulf Stream. Fortunately, their inexperience at sea allowed both of them to be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. 4 people lost their lives entirely unnecessarily. To this day, the bodies of the 4 crew members and the weapon used to kill them have not been found.
1990. 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Green, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Green threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor, but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed. Evening came, but the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them, and they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend, Kobe Laker, went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household, and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, the police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer. But when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that. Not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime, overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach. After escaping from the Bocas del Toro archipelago in early June 2010, Dayton and Laura crossed the border into Costa Rica, intending to lay low. The problem was that their faces were plastered across all newspapers and screens. In mid-July, they attempted to hide in a resort town an hour's drive from San Jose, but the hotel owners recognized them and called the police. With no real choice and the authorities on their tail, involving Interpol and the FBI, they decided to cross the border again. The natural border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua is the meandering San Juan River. On the 26th, Dayton and Laura stole a motorboat, tossing its owner into the water, and headed towards the Nicaraguan side. However, their escape was noticed by a group of soldiers. Confronted by a line of rifles, the fugitives surrendered. They were dressed in t-shirts, shorts, and flip-flops, appearing like clueless, lost tourists. However, their story didn't withstand scrutiny. They were handcuffed on the 2nd and taken to the nearest precinct. Cher Hughes and her husband Keith were enjoying life on a tropical island in Panama. It was a dream that initially seemed unattainable, to leave their mundane jobs, move to an exotic country, and acquire their own tropical island. Cher made it a reality in one of the most improbable places, among the tiny islands of Bocas del Toro, Panama. Cher grew up in St. Louis, where her beauty allowed her to enter the world of modeling at a young age. Later, she moved to Florida, where she started a company for innovative signage. She ran a successful business, was independent, and confidently pursued her dream of saving enough to travel extensively. She had traveled a lot, mainly within the USA, when a friend invited her to visit Bocas del Toro, and Cher couldn't pass up the opportunity. Bocas del Toro is the kind of place people go to escape the ordinary. A group of islands far from the coast of Panama and even farther from the beaten tourist paths. It's a place where life moves much slower and simpler. Cher visited the archipelago with her boyfriend Keith Worrell in 2000 and instantly fell in love with the picturesque land. It took them 7 days to decide where they wanted to spend the rest of their lives. With the money she had saved for traveling the world, she bought herself a piece of paradise. Cher and Keith had met 7 years prior in Florida when the attractive blonde walked into a bar owned by Keith. Seeing her big blue eyes and beautiful smile, Keith knew he was hooked. Keith was a carpenter and had built their dream home himself. He also owned several rental properties, providing them with additional income. Cher cultivated a garden and took in various animals, including a monkey and a Doberman Pinscher named Jack, who adored Cher and followed her everywhere. Cher's and Keith's relationship blossomed on the island, and in 2005 they got married, surrounded by friends and loved ones. Cher had a great relationship with her family, and in the following years they often visited her in Bocas del Toro. Particularly in 2010, her sister Judy had planned to visit her. This would have allowed Cher to take her mind off things. The smooth flow of her 5-year marriage with Keith hit some rough patches, and Keith even left the island. Cher was distraught, but they still loved each other, and everyone around them was convinced that they just needed time to reconcile. Against this backdrop, Cher's sister was scheduled to visit, and the girls were excited about the upcoming reunion, constantly discussing joint activities. But suddenly, Cher stopped answering calls and messages. Judy realized something was wrong. She contacted Cher's friends in Panama, who informed her that Cher was not at home, probably having left. When Keith learned that his wife had left the island, he was surprised, but believed he knew where she was. Cher had talked about living in Panama City, a bustling city where she could blend in and contemplate her separation from her husband in a peaceful environment. For people living in Panama, moving back and forth was commonplace. That was part of the charm of the islands, but still, Cher couldn't have just vanished suddenly, leaving her home, belongings, and unanswered calls. Then her friends received a message from her saying she had gone swimming. It inspired them momentarily, but not for long. Several more days passed without a sign of her. Then another message arrived, this time for Keith. It read, "I met someone else. He is better than you," implying that she had left with him. Keith decided to get to the bottom of it. He called Cher's best friend directly and asked if his wife had another man in her life. The friend assured him that there was no such thing, and that Cher genuinely wanted to reconcile with her husband. She couldn't have run away. Keith noticed something else in his wife's messages. They were written in a style that was not typical of her. Even her emails were very well written, with no modern abbreviations, and the capital letter was only at the beginning of the sentence. But this message was written entirely in capital letters with abbreviations. Then the messages simply stopped coming. Cher's Aunt Mary contacted the embassy in Panama and asked for help. They replied that people disappear all the time, and if the niece wanted to be found, she would contact them herself. But when Cher didn't call her father on his birthday, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that she hadn't run away with a guy, wasn't hiding in an apartment in Panama. Something had happened. Her friends tried to figure out what had happened and remembered another American from their company who had also disappeared suddenly. Did anyone know anything about him? What if Cher wasn't the only missing person? On the picturesque islands of Bocas del Toro, a crisis was brewing. It had been 2 months since Cher had stopped communicating. Now her family and friends were questioning whether her disappearance was related to the disappearance of another American, Bo Islar, who had suddenly left the island 4 months before her. Bo was a pleasant but very quiet man. The former antique dealer had moved from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and was considered somewhat of a recluse, to the extent that few noticed when he suddenly vanished. In principle, he could have left without telling anyone, as it is easy to disappear from Panama. His action became even clearer when it was revealed that he had sold his house to William Adolfo Cortez, also an American living in Panama. Bo had mentioned to friends that he wanted to sell the house and move to a new place. Apparently, that's exactly what he did. But the memory of Bo's house continued to bother Keith, Cher's husband, after the man left. The house looked as if its owner had just stepped out for a minute to the store. Towels hung on the back of a chair, dirty dishes were piled in the sink. His shoes and cane were by the entrance. It was strange, so rumors began. 2 Americans had disappeared. Could their disappearances be related? When it was discovered that Bo had stopped paying his bills, which was entirely unlike him, mutual acquaintances of Bo and Cher became concerned and contacted the police. But they had no grounds to begin an investigation because 2 adults who had previously expressed their desire to leave had disappeared. Then, Bo and Cher's friends turned to someone who could help them. Another foreigner, Don Winner, the owner of a news site for expatriates living in Panama. Long ago, Don arrived in Panama with the American military intelligence and stayed there. The case of the two missing Americans caught his attention, so from Panama City he traveled to Bocas del Toro and simply started talking to the locals, trying to find out what they knew about the situation. Indeed, everyone confirmed that Bo and Cher couldn't have just disappeared and left everything behind. He checked and found out that Cher and Bo's passports hadn't left Panama. That meant they were still here. But where? There was another piece of the puzzle that pointed directly to a man living among them. Bo Eisler was someone who had left last autumn. At the time, no one found it unusual, especially considering that he had sold his house to another foreigner, William Adolfo Cortez, known to everyone as Wild Bill. It should be noted that everyone on the island was simply called by their names or nicknames. For example, Keith and Cher were nicknamed Ken and Barbie. The owner of the local farm and bar was known as Wild Bill. Bill and his wife Jane had opened a bar in a remote area, accessible only by boat, where foreigners sometimes gathered for a drink or two. Usually, the flamboyant and charismatic Wild Bill stood out even among the fairly colorful personalities in Panama. He had established a local pirate club and was known for his lively parties. Don Winner delved deeper and found out that Bill had not only acquired Bo's house. Shortly after Bo disappeared, Bill and his wife became the president and secretary of a company they had created. Bill quickly renovated the house and advertised it for sale. It seemed like he was involved in buying and selling real estate. He had acquired a house in 2007 from the Brown family, who lived nearby Cher's house, the father, mother, and teenage son. Then he got Bo's house. However, it was only his next purchase that drew universal attention to him. Wild Bill unexpectedly announced that he had acquired all of Cher's property, including the island itself and the guest cottages built by Keith. Moreover, the island still had Keith's tools, Cher's belongings, and even her pets. Bill claimed that Keith would handle the matter with his wife when she returned. Keith requested at least the dogs and the tools back. Bill then returned one dog and several tools. Keith didn't intend to confront Bill, especially since everything was under Cher's name, and she did have the right to sell the property without informing her husband. But Keith couldn't believe it. They never fought over money. The island had become their home, and Cher simply wasn't the kind of person to act in this manner. Her relatives didn't believe it either. So Cher's Aunt Mary simply picked up the phone and called Wild Bill. She asked to see the property sale document. The man replied that he had signed a non-disclosure agreement. Mary asked to see the agreement and inquired if Cher had mentioned to Bill what she intended to do next. Bill stated that she had moved into an apartment in the capital. What about her belongings? Bill assured her that at Cher's request, he had sent her belongings, valuables, and money by air courier. Mary demanded to see the receipts for sending these things. She was convinced that Cher would never allow a barely acquainted man to rummage through her belongings in search of jewelry. There was more to it. No one could understand why Cher's entrusted dog, Jack, constantly jumped into the water and swam 2 kilometers to Bill's house again and again. However, Bill had many other concerns to think about besides the dog. Formerly cheerful and gregarious, he now tried to keep to himself, evading conversations. He was clearly nervous, and there was a reason for it. The more Don investigated the rumors, the more he became convinced that Bill was the key to finding Bo and Cher. It was a common denominator between the two of them. He had acquired their property, and both of them had disappeared. Don Winner decided to approach the official authorities and urged Kit to do the same. Kit went to the capital and informed the DIJ, the equivalent of the FBI in Panama, about everything. They did not brush him off and got to work. However, despite all the suspicions, there were no signs of criminal activity. There was essentially nothing to investigate. Then Don had an idea. He had heard a lot about how Wild Bill had an AK-47 and how he would sometimes shoot it to impress his friends. But in Panama, it is illegal for a civilian to possess such a weapon. Therefore, Don suggested that the police conduct a search, arrest him for possessing the weapon, and investigate what role he might play in the disappearance of the two people. And that's what they did. In July, officials flooded Wild Bill's house in uniform. The owners were nowhere to be found. The police began to search. They were looking for weapons when they saw Jack, Cher's dog. He had once again swum to Bill's house. The dog was behaving very nervously, circling around, barking at the policemen, and constantly running up the slope as if asking them to follow him into the jungle. The police officers, to their credit, followed Jack and found the spot where a pit had recently been dug. Kit was waiting at the foot of the hill at the time. He saw the officers climb up with shovels. They descended 2 hours later and asked him to look at something. In a shallow grave under a heap of garbage, the police found Sherhughes's body. She had been shot once in the back of the head. It was only now that Kit began to understand why Jack kept returning to Bill's house. He would swim 2 kilometers and just stand there by his late owner's grave, but the horror did not end there. As the police continued to search Bill's property, they found another mound of land. Under it lay Beau's body. He had also been shot in the back of the head. Furthermore, in Wild Bill's house, the police found a mass of other evidence, documents belonging to Cher and Beau, as well as Cher's phone from which messages had been sent. The police issued an all-points bulletin for Wild Bill and his wife, Jane, whom they also considered involved in the crimes. But they were too late. The two had disappeared. Bill and Jane were on vacation when, on June 11, 2010, a friend informed them that the police were at their house. That same night, they left for Costa Rica, where they moved from hotel to hotel, but they were recognized there, and they made a desperate attempt to get to Nicaragua by boat, where soldiers intercepted them at a checkpoint. It was only then that it was revealed that the man's real name was William Dathan Holbert. 30-year-old Dathan had been evading the American police since 2006. He had an impressive criminal history that stretched from the white sandy beaches of Bocas del Toro to the mountains of North Carolina. It was there that he was born, played football on the school team, got married, became the father of 3 children, and worked as a landscape designer. He was well liked by his employer at the sports center until he embezzled $25,000. And that was just the beginning. Dathan quit his job and his wife and fled with Laura Michelle Reese, who later transformed into Jane Cortez. In 2005, he began to commit real estate fraud. He sold someone else's house for $200,000. By the time the house's owner found out what had happened, Dathan had vanished. Meanwhile, he sold a stolen car, and when he was pulled over for speeding in Wyoming, he simply fled. However, after the man moved to Panama, his crimes became more sinister. The people of Panama were horrified, but they did not know that Dathan had much more heinous crime under his belt. Now, behind bars, Wild Bill was ready to reveal all his secrets, to which the people of Panama were not prepared. 27-year-old Laura Michelle Reese gave absolutely no comments and refused to speak to the police. She claimed to know nothing about the family that sold them the house in Panama, how much her husband paid for the property, or who the decorations, chains and bracelets of Cher Hughes, which were on Laura at the time of the arrest, belonged to. On the contrary, Dathan turned out to be surprisingly friendly and talkative. He was happy to return to Panama, happily conversing with journalists in Spanish. Dathan admitted that he invited Beau under the guise of a meeting with his lawyer regarding the sale of the house. He shot the man in the back of the head when he was driving him on his boat. As for Cher, it all started with friendly gatherings and dinners at his house. After that, he led her to see some animals behind the house, and when she turned to look at them, he killed her. The motive was obvious: money. He wanted to take possession of their property. But even the most experienced police officers were shocked when they heard what else Dathan had done. He drew a plan of his house, marking crosses where the bodies were buried. On his map, they counted not 2 crosses, but 5. Not only Cher and Beau died at the hands of Wild Bill, but also the father, mother, and their teenage son. The Brown family, one owners of Bill's house, Cher's neighbors. Dathan saw Michael Brown's advertisement for the sale of the house and called him. The men agreed to meet. Initially, Dathan planned to rob Michael, but when he saw his house in a remote, picturesque place, he changed his mind and decided to kill him and his family. Michael confided in Dathan and told him about his business. He explained that he managed capital through a shell company. Similar companies dealt with bearer shares. In essence, whoever owned the shares was the owner of the corporation. Michael's property in Panama also belonged to the company. If I kill him, Dathan pondered, the shares will be mine, and along with them, the real estate. So, being a guest in Michael's house, Dathan somehow asked the owner to show him the well he had dug on his property. He agreed and led him to the well. There, Dathan shot him in the back of the head. He returned to the house and told Michael's teenage son, Watson, that his father asked him to take a shovel and help him. He killed the son in the same way and in the same place as the father. Then he returned to the house and found Michael's wife, Manchitha Nankratok, in the garden. She was bent over, tending to the flowers. Dayton shot her too. To make sure that all three were dead, he fired an extra bullet into each. In the owner's cabin, he found documents and passwords from bank accounts. So he claims, although after the fate of the Brown family became known, there were rumors that Dayton tried to force Michael before killing him. Michael kept money in Hong Kong and transferred small sums to Panama. Dayton requested a new card with a new PIN because he didn't know the old one. He sent the request to Hong Kong because in Panama, they would have asked for identity confirmation. After some time, Dayton received the card in an envelope at the post office. All he had to do was say that he was picking it up for Michael Brown. In Bocas del Toro, such things are easier to do than said, boasted the man. In addition, Dayton confessed to killing another American, Jeffrey Klein. Dayton claimed that he died when they fought on a boat and that to avoid punishment, he devised his way of getting rid of the body. He buried him and then, after a few days, set up a picnic area near the burial site. After the truth came to light, people perceived him as a serial killer who kept victims' belongings in his house as souvenirs. But he himself claims not to be a serial killer. He does not deny the crimes and immediately confess to them, but they never gave him any pleasure. He did not wake up one morning with the decision to kill his neighbors. Dayton knows that he got what he deserved, but he cries and repents only for his wife, who now has to go through all of this. It will take 7 years to achieve justice. During this time, his wife divorced Dayton while the two were in prison. In August 2017, he was found guilty and sentenced to 47 years in prison, while his wife was sentenced to 26 years. If he has other victims, it will be practically impossible to find out. After all, Dayton mainly hunted loners before he met Cher. Choosing a sociable girl with a lot of friends and relatives who would not stop looking for her was his main mistake. It's no wonder they say that some people never disappear. Even while in prison before the trial, Dayton used his phone, computer, and internet access. He continued to log into his Facebook page and even became a sponsor of the prisoners' football team, buying them sports uniforms. Today, he serves as the chairman of the Christian Organization for Inmates, leads an international human rights organization for prisoners, was appointed a chaplain and later a pastor of the Catholic Church in prison. Finally, he acts as a mediator and negotiator between various aggressive prison gangs. On January 7, 2019, he married a local girl, Elizabeth Nunes, and confesses that he enjoys conjugal visits very much. At the end of the year, Dayton published his prison memoirs, in which he described his escape from the authorities, arrest on the Nicaragua-Costa Rica border, extradition to Panama, and the first years in confinement.
At the center of this tragic saga is 19-year-old Jack Elliott, a talented athlete and football player, known by his friends as an open and easygoing guy with a big heart and a reserved smile. He eagerly awaited the start of his business education at Texas Christian University, after which he planned to work in the commercial real estate field, where many of his neighbors in Newport Beach were involved. The university met all of Jack's requirements. It ranks among the top 20 business schools, boasts a large campus, and offers starting salaries for graduates exceeding $60,000 per year. Additionally, Jack was drawn to the excellent sports teams at the university. Before the start of his education in the summer of 2019, the young man organized a poolside party at his parents' house for future university students. It was there that he met Delaney Brennan, who planned to study merchandising in the fashion industry. There was an immediate attraction and light flirtation between the two young people, which grew into a romantic relationship. 8 weeks into his education, Jack and a few new friends rented a car and set off for a music festival in Austin on Thursday, October 10, 2019. The 3-day festival featured popular performers such as Cardi B, Billie Eilish, Childish Gambino, and others. Like most of his classmates, Jack had a fake ID that allowed him to stock up on low-alcohol drinks, vodka, and tequila. On the last day of the festival, Saturday, Jack's father, Brett Elliott, video-called his son, who appeared on the screen freshly shaved and ready for the evening in Austin. He looked attractive and happy, Brett recalls. That was the last time he saw Jack. On Monday, October 14th, Jack shared his plans with his mother, Amy Elliott, to go with his friends to Lake Travis, where one of his friends' fathers had a boat. Amy's heart sank. For some reason, she didn't like the idea of her son going on this trip. Let's call it mother's intuition. She didn't know his friends, knew nothing about Lake Travis, and certainly couldn't know how right she was. Of course, she didn't discourage her son from having a good time with his friends. So, jumping into different cars, the 12 students set off on their journey. Carson Neal, one of the teenagers, whose father managed a marina, and had his own boat, was leading the way. The young people couldn't resist stopping by a local store where they bought cigarettes, ice, snacks, and loaded up on vodka, beer, and hard seltzer. At around 3:30 p.m., they set off from the shore. Carson Neal was at the helm. Despite his youth, Carson had extensive experience as a captain and had undergone safety training for boating since the age of 15. It was a sunny midday, perfect for swimming and wakeboarding. When it was Carson's turn to ride, he handed the boat's controls to Elle Weber. Elle had been behind the wheel before, although she had never officially learned how to do it. At some point, the students ran out of beer, so they returned to the marina, where Carson grabbed a pack of 12 bottles from his father's office fridge. After that, the students continued their entertainment. At 8:27 p.m., an hour and a half after sunset, the boat suddenly jumped and roared as if it had collided with something. Carson switched the boat to cruise control. It was moving at a speed slightly above 10 miles per hour, with Elle still at the helm. It was only then that the students noticed Jack's absence. Chaos erupted on the boat as the young people realized the significance of the commotion. Carson turned the boat around and directed it towards the spot where they believed they had lost Jack. Friends shouted his name and illuminated the water with the flashlights on their phones. Many were scared, crying, and could barely speak coherently, Carson recalls. I tried to remain as calm as possible because I knew it was serious, and panicking would only worsen the situation. He jumped into the water, checked the propeller, and searched for Jack a little longer. However, after searching for no more than 5 minutes, the students headed towards the shore, realizing that they couldn't do anything more on the lake. In that moment, amid the chaos, horror, and panic, a lie was born. On their way back, the teenagers poured the remaining alcohol overboard. Since both Carson and Elle had been drinking, Carson consumed about 5 bottles of beer, while Elle had 2 seltzers and 4 shots of vodka. They convinced another student, Anthony Salazar, to claim that he was the one operating the boat. Anthony was feeling unwell that day and hadn't consumed anything. Obviously, out of a sense of solidarity with his friends, he agreed to go along with the trick. Elle made the distress call to the rescue service. For some inexplicable reason, she identified herself as Elle Macpherson to the police, although she later claimed to be unaware of the name of the famous supermodel and actress. When the teenagers arrived at the shore, they were already being awaited by officers from the Travis County Sheriff's Office. The individuals were interrogated separately. However, their tangled stories didn't add up and would not come together for a long time. That night in Corona Del Mar, Brett Elliott answered a call from a friend who asked if he had heard anything from Jack, as there was news circulating on social media about an incident involving TCU students on a boat. Brett wasn't too scared and even felt somewhat relieved when another student's father confirmed that he hadn't heard anything. Just to be safe, Brett called the Travis County Sheriff's Office, but they didn't tell him much about the incident. He still wasn't worried until his wife's phone rang. Someone from the 512 area code, Travis County, was calling. It was the sheriff's office. The parents were informed that Jack had gone missing after falling into the lake. However, the search wouldn't resume until daybreak. During that dreadful phone conversation, the police told the father that Jack fell into the water while attempting a backflip. The parents immediately doubted this because their son wouldn't have been able to do a backflip, especially on a boat. To confirm their thoughts, they later heard another story: Jack fell overboard while he was feeling nauseous. 2 days after the tragic incident, the police no longer attempted to find Jack alive and focused their efforts on locating his body. The Elliots mourned, and not knowing how their son had died only intensified their pain. They simply wanted to know the truth and find Jack. As if in response to their pleas, several teenagers who were on the boat gathered with their parents in the conference room of the Courtyard by Marriott Hotel in Fort Worth. The students activated the speakerphone and called Brett and Amy, promising to reveal the whole truth. Elle mostly spoke. Sobbing loudly, she assured the Elliots that the teenagers sympathized with them over Jack's death and all the stories they had to hear as his parents. The girl confessed that she had been at the helm, although she noted that no one was really in control of the boat. However, none of the students could say how Jack fell overboard. "We don't know how Jack fell overboard," she said. "We don't know if he stood up to move and slipped or was fixing his hair. We don't know what he was doing. These are the most honest answers we can provide you right now," the girl assured them. But that wasn't true. Gathered in the hotel with their parents, the teenagers had previously decided not to tell the Elliots the truth. However, not everyone agreed to keep silent. Soon after the call with Brett, the father of one of the teenagers who was present in the hotel conference room contacted them. "Jack didn't fall overboard," he said. "He was pushed." Lake Travis is an artificially created body of water, with a depth of 64 meters, and a length of over 100 kilometers. The shores are lined with pecan tree groves, and their tangled branches seem to rise straight from the depths. 16 divers, 5 boats, and search teams arrived at the lake and began the search, despite the obstructing tree groves. They had a submersible apparatus with an attached camera. However, it couldn't capture clear footage in the murky water. Brett Elliott managed to contact the California-based company, Dua Marine Operations. They specialize in deep-sea technologies, underwater exploration, and salvaging wreckage after disasters such as plane crashes. Dua employees brought a remotely operated underwater vehicle, ROV, with a sonar to create a map of the lake's underwater world. Sending people down without this mapping would have been too dangerous. The row traversed the top of the tree groves, creating a map of them. Within a day or two, Jack's body was discovered at a depth of 33 meters. Another row with a mechanical arm lifted the body to a shallower depth, where divers could retrieve it. Overall, the search took about 10 days. Brett and Amy received their son's body but still didn't receive answers to their questions. Until one person who was on the boat decided to speak directly to Jack's parents. Carly Martin, a former TCU student, secretly traveled from Chicago to Orange County in December 2019 with her mother to tell the Elliots what she knew, that Delaney pushed Jack into the water. Carly didn't take part in that disgraceful phone call. According to her, she didn't lie to the police either. However, she was so traumatized by what happened and the consequences of that trip to the lake that she dropped out of college. Her conversation with the Elliots became a turning point for her. That conversation, Carly said, was the beginning of my healing. It was the toughest conversation of my life, telling the parents how their son died and revealing all the lies surrounding his death, admits Carly. I couldn't believe there was one person on that boat who was capable of telling the truth to the parents, that Delaney pushed Jack into the water. But now Brett and Amy have even more questions. Delaney and Jack were friends. Why would she push him overboard? Why are all the other students covering for her? In order to get answers to their own questions, they will have to take legal action. In January 2020, the Elliots filed a lawsuit against Carson, Delaney, and Elle, hoping to compel them to testify and tell the truth about what happened that day. If they continued to evade answers, they faced charges of perjury. By the end of 2020, several teenagers had given sworn statements. Despite their attempts to invoke the Fifth Amendment, which protects against self-incrimination, the investigation managed to uncover new details. The day started off perfectly. The whole group was having a great time, some were swimming in the lake, others sunbathed or wakeboarded. Carson showed his friends where the life jackets were stored. However, apart from that, he did not provide any safety instructions on the boat. So the young people were dancing on the slippery wet deck of the moving vessel while music blasted from the speakers. When the sun began to set, Jack sat on the railing at the bow of the boat. He was not alone but with Delaney. The other students either didn't pay attention to them or simply didn't see them, and the only person who witnessed this incident was Elle. She saw Delaney and Jack flirting and kissing. At some point, Delaney playfully pushed Jack, but this light touch was enough for the young man to fall overboard. Almost immediately, the boat made a loud noise, and the students realized they had hit something. But to their horror, they realized that the propeller had struck Jack's body. Panic ensued. Delaney kept repeating, "He fell, I didn't mean to push him." After the students failed to retrieve Jack from the water, they returned to the shore, pouring out the remaining alcohol, and agreeing to lie about what actually happened. It's astonishing that after Jack's death, his friends lacked the empathy to overcome their desire to avoid the consequences of their actions. They decided that there was nothing they could do for him anymore and that they needed to worry about their own interests. In reality, they should have immediately contacted the police and told them everything. As for the alcohol, they could have simply remained silent about it. It's unbelievable that 11 people agreed to deceive others. Elle Weber didn't even give her real name to the police. Did she really think the police would never find her just because she claimed to be a supermodel? Did she forget that there were 10 other people on the boat? Perhaps she wanted to blend into the crowd when they disembarked on the shore. But the lies of the other students were even more serious and naive. They couldn't enjoy their time at the lake without incident but considered themselves clever enough to outsmart the police. It feels as if they decided to reenact the movie I Know What You Did Last Summer, where a group of young people decides to cover up someone's death. However, the students probably didn't watch the movie to the end because things don't turn out well for the characters. It's like being inspired by a cruise ship after watching only the first 20 minutes of the movie Titanic. Regardless, the lawsuit was settled confidentially out of court. However, by the end of 2021, the students faced criminal charges, not for Jack's death, but for concealing evidence. The most serious charges were brought against Delaney and Carson for tampering with evidence, as Delaney deleted the video on her phone, and Carson disposed of alcohol overboard. They face imprisonment for up to 10 years and a maximum fine of $10,000. Another student, Joshua Evans, may face punishment for providing alcohol to minors. Anthony Salazar is charged with perjury, and Elle Weber is accused of providing false statements to a police officer. Now the students claim that they were coerced and terrified by what was happening. They regret not telling the police everything from the beginning. Delaney even got a tattoo of Jack's initials on her wrist to always remember him, and how much he loved life. It's quite possible that when the students got rid of the alcohol or deleted the video, they didn't realize that it was criminally punishable evidence concealment because they knew that Jack's death was an accident. They went to the lake without planning to kill anyone, and this tragic incident clearly demonstrates the consequences of a dangerous mix of alcohol, recklessness, impulsiveness, and poor decisions. They will all have to live with the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives.